Hi, good morning, everyone. Welcome to another lecture sponsored by the Berlin Guides Association, Bündnis Berliner Stadtführer e.V. Today, we're really excited to present Elizabeth Mason, one of our members, and she's going to present a very interesting lecture on a topic that I certainly don't know very much about at all, German terrorism, the student protest movements of the 1960s, and the creation of the RAF, the Rote Armee Fraktion. If you're watching this on YouTube, thank you so much for joining in. And for those of us who are here while it's happening live, we really appreciate you tuning in on this cold and snowy February day. So without further ado, I will pass it over to Elizabeth. Thank you so much for doing this.
Not a problem. So yeah, for anyone who doesn't know me, that of course can be BBS members who have not heard my exceptionally loud voice as a tour guide in Berlin, or people who are tuning in to this later on. My name's Elizabeth. I'll call myself Lizzie because that's normally what I go by. A bit about me, I'm half American, half German. So yes, that's why I have a certain accent when I speak English. But why I've put together this lecture for you today is because I study, I research as well. I'm a published sociologist, I guess would be my category now. And what I research is I research social movements, and I particularly research the motivations behind why people do certain things, and particularly why people either facilitate or carry out personally criminal acts, in this case, mass criminal acts. So for this lecture itself, what it is meant to do is the aim of this talk is meant to provide you with a broad overview of the social, political, and historical factors which motivated certain individuals to engage in acts of political violence. You may want to refer to them as terrorist acts, as the mainstream would call it, and why they joined the organization that is operational in particularly West Germany in the 1970s, 1980s, and 1990s, which is known as the Rote Armee Fraktion, or the Red Army Faction in English, or the RAF. So before we begin, I think it's quite important because by its nature, this lecture does touch on what are of course very emotive, very sensitive topics, which is namely terrorists and terrorism. So talking about these kind of events, they very much can bring to mind things like 9/11, things like the 7/7 bombings. And of course, if we went to the Middle Eastern theater, or if we talked about the continent of Africa, we're talking about dozens, if not hundreds of events of terrorism per year. So for that reason, I think it's very important to discuss very, very briefly my background in talking about what motivates people to do these actions. It's very important, in my opinion, to note that in discussing these events, even though we may have a cognitive understanding of what steps, the A, B, and C processes that may bring someone to join these organizations and what may lead them to engage in acts of violence against other people, in no way does myself or any of my colleagues who are having a much broader basis to talk about this than I do, in no way in understanding why people do these things are we sympathizing with these events. Of course, because the end activity of these actions is that lives were taken away, is that people for their foreseeable future are traumatized by these events. So if in any way that might be misinterpreted, I do think it is quite important to state that my views on this are always sympathizing with the victims and are to engage in a discussion, engage in an understanding of why people carry out these events so that we may create effective policies to try to avoid these processes in the future. So I think it can get quite important in some of the things that are going to be covered in this presentation. So what I want to start with, can I not? That now? Oh, it's not going now. Oh, there we go. Oh, technological difficulties. So starting with the very basics, given the fact that as me and Constance were talking about earlier, if you are not a member of this country, it is often a group. The RAF is often a group that is overshadowed, especially in the modern discourse, by people like the IRA in Northern Ireland, or the PLO, of course, in the Middle East, or ISIS, or the Taliban. So who are the RAF? Who is this terroristic group? So this group originally founded itself with its first act in 1970. Its foundation was based on the liberation of one of the key members, Andreas Baader, and this organization carried out activities until its disbandment in 1988. They are most recognized today for the bombing of the US military base at Heidelberg in 1972 and the kidnap and murder of Hans-Martin Schleyer in the autumn of 1977 as a part of the so-called German Autumn. The RAF acted on a concept that is heavily discussed among anti-establishment or anti-imperialist group that emerges in West Germany in the late 1960s, which was the escalation from protest to armed struggle. So the RAF envisioned themselves as urban guerrillas who would inspire the wider public to take up arms in popular revolution to overthrow what they saw as an immoral capitalist government. The name itself, the Rote Armee Fraktion, the Red Army Faction, is associated with the adaptation of certain Marxist socialist elements, namely the need for a mass awakening of the proletariat, of the general public, to overthrow capitalism in an act of revolution against what they saw as a corrupt state in West Germany at this time. The popular abbreviation of the organization's name, the RAF, is also said to be a deliberate choice, alluding to the British Royal Air Force, RAF, because like the British bombed Germany from the sky in World War II, they would do the same on the ground. So the terrorist group would do the same on the ground by setting fire to the symbols of modern West Germany. So that was a very conscious allusion, in fact. So where we are going to start is we're going to start with the connection from the student protest movements of the 1960s and how this situation escalates in violence to a carrying out of what was known as urban guerrilla warfare in the manifesto. So student protest movements of the mid to late 1960s very much build off of this idea of a neo-imperialist vision of the modern West or Western nations, largely centered around the United States as the head of the Western Bloc throughout the Cold War period. So ultimately, what the student protest movement largely disagreed with is they disagreed with the United States, quote unquote, neo-imperialist expansion. And the largest expression of that student protesters focused on was, of course, the human rights violations against the general public that were being carried out in the Vietnam War. So, of course, this was using chemical warfare against the general population in an effort to defeat paramilitary and military groups in Vietnam, and also, of course, the use of nuclear warfare, if not in actual practice in the Cold War period, but very much the building up of nuclear weaponry was a key target of these student protest movements as well. So the student protest movement was particularly influenced by the so-called Frankfurt School of Socialism. According to this school, repression in advanced capitalist societies was not just a matter of police and the courts, it was inherent to all institutions. So the corruption, the depravity, the attachment to the imperialist vision was something that was echoed in the educational system, in corporations, culture, and even in the language used by society itself. And this language limited its members and prevented them from realizing that there might be alternative ways of living. And very much we see this echoed, this concept in the actions, either consciously or unconsciously, taken by the West German government at this time. So very much so the student protest movement saw West Germany in their very close relationship with the United States in this era as being complicit with these neo-imperialist policies, if not actively assisting in this process. And very much so they were seen as being complicit and corrupted by the allure of capitalism in becoming complicit in the human rights violation committed against Vietnamese people in the war in Vietnam. Additionally, because of the significant presence of the United States military in West Germany, the participation of West Germany in the Marshall Plan, and again, that intimate political relationship between West Germany and the US at this time, West Germany and anyone who supported US influence was seen as being complicit in the war crimes being committed against the Vietnamese people. So that's not just the government, it's not just people particularly attached with the government, it was anyone who was supporting this government, this capitalist society that indeed was very popular, was seen as the image of success in West Germany in the 1950s and 1960s. So very much so, the anti-Vietnam protests expressed sympathy with any opposition to the United States military, particularly the Viet Cong. This contributed to a frequent media opposition to any anti-Vietnam sentiments, any anti-Vietnam protests that were going on. And very much so, this actually emerges as a media battle against any any Vietnamese sympathizers, anti-American sympathizers, and very much so this comes to its greatest expression in the media battle against protesters and against so-called socialist thinking by the Axel Springer Publishing Corporation. It was even suggested that the Axel Springer Publishing Corporation, which controlled 78% of the newspaper and magazine circulation across Germany at this time, that very much so they were waging a war against the student protest movement. And this is where we start to see a deep misinterpretation, right, of what was called terrorism at the time. So very much so, the student movement was seen as, quote unquote, the Trojan horse of communism, particularly in the city of Berlin. So you could see what was being attached to or what was being used in this era was much like the US was doing. West Germany used anti-communism as a powerful form of political control that was used to stigmatize people as public enemies. So very much student protesters who were using socialist thought to fight back against imperialism, to have a pushback against the West German government and their policies at this time, were being labeled as communists and were very much being demonized by the press. So one of the most famous examples of this is something called the Pudding Incident of 1967, which makes me very happy. The name itself. So this is where a group of socialist thinking students, primarily students here in Berlin, which was called the Kommune 1. So they had a communal living situation in West Berlin. They had planned through bags of flour and yogurt that they were going to throw them at the visiting US President, President Humphrey in Berlin. So in line with their unique protest method, what they wanted to do is with the US Vice President Humphrey was make a laughing stock out of him by throwing yogurt and flour on him. So ultimately, in the report of this event, the Axel Springer Publishing Corporation alluded to the fact or put out the fact to the public that instead of just wanting to throw yogurt and flour during this pudding incident of 1967, that they'd actually planned a terrorist attack. So they actually said, okay, instead of just wanting to throw flour and yogurt on the visiting US vice president, that they had actually planned with bombs, explosive chemicals, and plastic bags filled with explosives and stones, that they were extremists that were actually going to attack a highly respected guest into West Germany. So actually the headlines of this very much alluded to the fact that these protesters were being directly equated with terrorist activities at this time. So really the focus of the Axel Springer Publishing Corporation's attack on the student protest movement was largely focused on the figurehead of this movement, who is, of course, Rudi Dutschke. We have a street named after him here in Berlin, if you haven't been. So being a particular focus of the Springer media attacks, Rudy Duchka was actually labeled as Red Rudy. So he became a particular target for right-wing counter-protests and very much becomes the center of what was widely considered in the student protest movement as a vendetta against Rudy Duchka, and was seen, this battle against him, this media war against him, was seen as an obvious motivating factor behind his attempted assassination in 1968. So with the next slide, we will discuss essentially how political violence, or what you would call perhaps terrorist activity, was used in this era to describe a very broad range of what was viewed as antisocial behavior, becoming part of the picture when violence between the police, the so-called state as it was seen, and the protesters become so severe that acts of terroristic violence very much become what is seen as to be the only answer to bring about change. So an escalation of violence, with an escalation of pushback by the government, by the police, do we escalate from protest into acts of violence? So these events that build up this tension, that build up this ladder towards political violence, are what we call transformative events. There we go. So we have several of what we call transformative events here. One that is very well known in Germany is the Shah's visit of June 1967, so the Iranian Shah, and then resulting the murder of one student protester named Benno Ohnesorg on the 2nd of June 1967. So on June 2nd, the Student Protesters Organization organized a march to protest the state visit of the Shah of Iran. Iranian students studying in Berlin portrayed the Shah as a despot, as a dictator who was backed by West German countries. So essentially, the human rights violations he was carrying out, Western countries were seen as being complicit, if not actively facilitating this process. So the government, wanting to avoid confrontation, that is the West German government, banned the student protest march. Nevertheless, while the Shah and West German politicians enjoyed a performance of Mozart's the Zauberflöte, or the Magic Flute, outside the German opera, the Deutsche Oper in West Berlin, first the Shah supporters, so a large group of supporters of the Shah, who were put in front of the student protesters to cheer him on, to make it seem like, oh yes, everyone wanted the Shah to be here, that he was very much a welcome guest by society. The Shah supporters, and then actually later on the police themselves, attacked several thousand protesters who were protesting against the Shah's presence in West Germany. There started to be a very large chaotic fight breaking out between these various groups. During the chaos of fleeing protesters, who of course are fleeing the Shah supporters and are fleeing the police, in this chaos, just around the corner from the Deutsche Oper, from the Opera House in West Berlin, in what was then a parking lot at Kummerstrasse 66 in Berlin, a young protester named Benno Ohnesorg was shot in the head by Karl-Heinz Kürass, who was a policeman in plain clothing. Later, Karl-Heinz Kürass was actually found out to be an agent of the Stasi, who actually, if you're not aware of the Stasi, the secret police of East Germany, who was actually sent to infiltrate the West Berlin police. And his particular role in infiltrating the West Berlin police was meant to help escalate political unrest in any opportunity that he found. Now, after the murder of Benno Ohnesorg, during the next week, roughly 100,000 students participated in funeral march and silent vigils across Germany. Having previously been limited to Berlin, this now became a national student protest movement, reaching its climax in Bonn on the 11th of May, 1968, where 50,000 students marched in one of the largest post-war history protests. So this is here one of the most famous images associated with the Benno Ohnesorg murder, where essentially the police who had been participating, who had been present in this event, particularly Karl-Heinz Kürass, really did not know what to do. These police actually then kind of left the scene of this and left this woman here to attempt to care for this young man, of course, with a shot to the skull. Help did not arrive quickly enough, and of course he passed away on the scene. So the next section that we have, we need to go back here, excuse me. So next section we have, we already discussed this a little bit, the idea of this national media effort to discredit the student protests, to very much paint them as communist, of subversive elements in Germany. And of course, that particular focus on the leader of the student protest movement, Rudi Dutschke. So forwarding throughout that period of the Springer media attacks, we get to the 11th of April, 1968, where a young man who actually traveled to Berlin called Josef Bachmann traveled to Rudi Dutschke's house, which was at 140 Kurfürstendamm, so in the center of West Berlin, Charlottenburg. This would-be assassin, Josef Bachmann, tracked down Rudi Dutschke to his home. And while he shouted, "You filthy communist pig," after identifying Dutschke, Rudi Dutschke was shot 3 times. So he was first shot actually in the cheek, which knocked him off his bicycle. And then Bachmann proceeded to get closer to Dutschke and shot him twice more, once in the head and then in the shoulder. So following the shooting of Rudi Dutschke, which miraculously he does actually survive this event. This sparked a mass wave of student protests who actually saw the attack on Rudi Dutschke, someone who had transcended the various student movement groups, someone who very much became a figurehead of this anti-imperialist, of the anti-parliamentary movement, as it's called in Germany. Very much an attack on Dutschke was seen as an attack on the entire movement, on the literally tens of thousands of students who participated in this. Now, of course, all that anger particularly becomes focused on the Axel Springer Publishing Group, who were seen, as we've talked about earlier, responsible, because it was believed that the demonization of the student protest movement being portrayed as a terrorist movement, as the Trojan horse of communism, directly led to Dutschke's attempted assassination. So the Axel Springer building on Kochstrasse, which is right up the street from Checkpoint Charlie, one of the most famous locations to visit here in Berlin, that publishing house, the Axel Springer Publishing House, was marched upon on the same day of Rudi Dutschke's assassination in that evening. And essentially what happened is a riot situation broke out. So you had students and actually other figures, key figures, to the RAF group, such as Ulrike Meinhof and such as Horst Mahler, who would be, of course, the famous lawyer terrorist, as he becomes known as. These literally thousands of people start throwing stones to break the windows of the publishing house, and then set several Springer delivery trucks on fire with Molotov cocktails. And very much so, what we see here is we see a very significant step in the escalation from peaceful, what should be, even though it wasn't necessarily seen this way by the West German government at the time, what should be a peaceful, legal form of disagreeing with the government, i.e. public protest, something that Germany now holds very highly and respects that privilege among the German people today. This very much is demonized. And through this oppression of not being able to speak out, tension, of course, starts escalating between the government, and that is vocalized by the police and their actions. And what we start to see is right after the assassination of Rudi Dutschke, we see a large circle of people within the student protest movement saying, okay, what we're doing is not good enough. All right, our figureheads are being possibly assassinated. And for this reason, we have no other choice but also to take up firepower, also to commit acts of violence against these people who are seen to be oppressing us. And very much, of course, this escalates further on March 11th, 1968, which becomes one of the worst instances of street fighting in Berlin during this era. And it is known as the Battle of Tagalog. So essentially, what occurs on this day is approximately 1,000 students gathered in protest against the trial of Horst Mahler. So again, the lawyer terrorist, as he's sometimes known as, he later becomes a key figure in the RAF. He is arrested for taking part in the Axel Springer riot, as we just discussed. And a fight in front of the courthouse where he is being tried, where this trial is taking place, a fight breaks out between the demonstrators and the police. So demonstrators gain a brief upper hand by throwing stones at the police, by forcing the police back. However, demonstrators only have that upper hand for a brief period before the police drive in water cannons and use tear gas to disperse the protesters. Now, in the chaos, some demonstrators during this period do attempt to storm the courthouse on Tagalog, which is in the center of the district of Charlottenburg. Now, from the Battle of Tagalog, 130 police were injured and 22 demonstrators were injured as well. So you can see here, we really do have the height, the last step of police brutality, police oppression, starting with the murder of Benno Onesorg, as we discussed, and how this then becomes, it becomes mass, right? It becomes something that does not just affect one person. It becomes the status quo. It becomes seen as the standard of how the police are going to react to demonstrators. And with the use of police brutality, we see again and again among groups that do descend into terroristic acts, this is a key connection, right, of why it is seen that protests, that peaceful means, are considered to be no longer effective. If the government doesn't listen to you, if you're going to be injured or possibly killed by demonstrating, by speaking out against the government, that is the moment where political violence is seen to be the only way forward to affect change. And that is really very important to understand how we get mobilization from protests into what we would call mass media terrorist activity. Forwarding again. So I want to talk a little bit about what are some of the possible motivations for membership to the RAF, to the Rote Armee Fraktion. And there's several key ones. One is a perceived generational conflict. And this is something I've talked a lot about with my mother about, and I've seen kind of the effects of course, anyone who kind of grew up in Germany probably saw elements of this in various ways. So ultimately, this generational conflict is that it was felt by young people in the 1960s that their parents really didn't understand them, and that a radical break from the past was needed, and that it was normal to be radical. It was normal to be provocative, right? So one thing that we might equate this to, and that is often quite laughed at in Germany, is something called the freie Körperkultur, the free body culture. So you kind of go around naked, and it's like it's kind of a protest against conservatism and what was seen to be the society at the time. So from generational conflict, another key motivation for joining a radical political group like the RAF was a need to break from the past. So one of the major point of contention for those who joined the protest movements in the 1960s and then later fringe violent groups such as the RAF was very much that the current government in West Germany at the time was serving their own interests and not the interests of the people that they are meant to serve. They were seen as being guilty of participating in corrupt neo-imperialist policies. So again, via that relationship with the United States, and it exploited impoverished or so-called third world countries, such as Vietnam. Really though, what is one of the catalyzing features, what is one of the motivating features that we hear again and again and again from former RAF members is very much there is a strong view against the current West German leadership at this time. So the makeup of the West German government, especially the key political coalition that was running the government at this time, it saw many former National Socialists, so many former members of the Nazi Party making up the political elite, making up the people who are making the decisions in the country at the time. So this included the elected Bundeskanzler, Kurt Kissinger, who was a member of the National Socialist Party, the Nazi Party, from 1933 to 1945, and also the Bundespräsident, the federal president, Karl Lübke, who was seen as responsible at one point for the intake and allocation of a forced labor camp, a concentration camp prisoners in the concentration camp Peenemünde. And former NSDP, National Socialist members in such positions of power was really an issue for the younger generation and something that they couldn't come to terms with. That these people, instead of being incarcerated, instead of being held accountable for the crimes that they committed, indeed were leading the country. And that is actually why the RAF termed the government at the time the Auschwitz generation, because these crimes were seen as not being answered for. So it was also perceived that anyone who spoke out against these individuals being in power, leading the country and the government as a whole, they were labeled as enemies of the state. They were labeled as inherently un-German if they questioned these policies. So you can see very much where the tension may indeed might arise. So next we're going to talk a little bit about the psychological factors which drew members to join the RAF. So ultimately, a few of these overlapped, such as the rejection of National Socialism, which we discussed, the so-called German national shame. So very much in this era, in the 60s and the 70s, it is something very much that the generation who is alive, who is active, who are adults during World War II, during the Holocaust, during National Socialism, did not talk about these events. So that includes my own family. We really have no idea in my German family what occurred, what events happened during this era, especially if they are negative. So very much so, children saw their parents as closed, as shut, as not recognizing what occurred during this era and not being proactive in making sure that that Germany can build itself off of being open, off of understanding the past and moving forward from that. So it was very much a sticking point between the younger generation and the older generation in West Germany in this time. Now, in addition to that, we talked a little bit earlier about how the generational differences also affected how children saw their parents, not just as maybe being complicit in the crimes of National Socialism, but as not understanding them, as not understanding their perspective. So very much you have young, impressionable, late teens, early 20s, West Germans who maybe would join the RAF, were really looking for something to belong to, right? People that understood their way of thinking. For example, we know that one former RAF member named Margaret Schiller, one of the reasons that she felt kind of so lost is that she was a lesbian, she was gay. And very much you could see if Germany is conservative at this time, if they're kind of closed about anything that deviates from one specific view of society, being gay would be very difficult to talk about, to open up with your parents at that time. So the RAF was actually known for having no issues with that. There were several lesbian relationships in particular that occurred during this group, during this group's existence. So you could see how a search to belong was something that was very strong that brought them to the table as well. Now, in addition to that search to belong, very much the charismatic leadership, that is the leadership of Ulrike Meinhof, of Andreas Baader, and of Gudrun Edslin, the key three members in what is known as the first generation of the RAF, were something that very strongly drew young members to join this organization. So very much they were seen as people who acted, right, in no way that these members had ever seen before. They had ideas that were certain, that were radical, that were going to change things, right? And very much so, we know that not only with the RAF, but with other groups in Europe, in the world at this time, there is a strong desire, there is a strong belief that by participating in these organizations, by participating in these actions that indeed were violent, indeed led to the loss of human life, that they were going to change history, right? Very much so the RAF believed that by facilitating acts of political violence, that they were going to awaken the mass consciousness and actually cause a revolution in West Germany, overthrowing that corrupt power structure that was in control at this time. So there was actually a belief, there was actually an idea that they were going to change the world, which I think is quite motivating, especially for any young person, but for any person to have that idea is very strong. Where are we next? One of my favorites. So what I did here is I actually just wanted to put up a few quotes that is me not just saying, projecting the psychological reasons why someone might join this organization. We, of course, in no way have any idea of the full psychological motivations why anyone joins such a group. Of course, it is impossible to create an A plus B plus C formula that equals someone engaging in terrorism, that equals someone engaging in really any criminal activity. What we can do is we can say that certain elements, a desire to belong, a desire to change the status quo, conflict perhaps with family members such as your parents, these things can possibly in some ways make it more likely that you may seek out such groups. It does by no means give a definitive, as I said, A plus B plus C formula for someone to join. But just putting up a few of these here, in particular, the one that I've just put up right now. I quite love it because what it illuminates in this case with one of the key members, key leaders of the group, Andreas Baader, is not only is the RAF seeking to change the way that they live, to change society in general, how they vocalize this is even by using different language, is instead of using posh, classy, reserved language, what they wanted to do is just say it like it is, right? To just call people tossers and bitches, excuse me for using the term, and very much transcend this bourgeoisie language, which was seen as not allowing people to communicate. And I think that's really quite a fascinating kind of vocalization of what these young people were trying to achieve. So last quote here, of course, by Horst Mahler, so a key member of the RAF and a lawyer, very much vocalizes this idea of the RAF and members of the RAF believed that they could actually change the course of history, that it could actually incite a revolution to overthrow the current government at the time. So where are we next? Now, of course, one of the ways that the RAF facilitated members to commit acts of extreme violence, especially against the police, especially against foreign military. In some cases, of course, these activities did injure or even kill civilian people, is we see a very strong need to dehumanize the other side, the people that the RAF believed that they were fighting against. So this quote is indeed one of the most famous quotes by key RAF leader Ulrike Meinhof. And here what we have is she directly equates men in uniform, i.e. the police, to being something less than human, right? So being less than human, being pigs as they are termed here, means that there is no longer any obligation or any logic in talking with and trying to rationalize with these people. They're no longer human beings. They're never going to cognitively be able to understand what is being talked about, and therefore the only logical course of action is to shoot them. So of course, this in no way bears reality. Of course, it's very important to say this. But what you can see is you can see a very clear impression from the key leadership of the RAF to distance themselves and to distance their members from the crimes that they're committing. They're not being committed against human beings. And this is a process that we call cognitive dissonance, right? So to separate yourself emotionally, morally from the crimes that you are committing. It is really only through charismatic leadership, of leadership that other members looked up to. That is the membership of Baader, Eslin, and Ulrike Meinhof, the quote that you see here. And it is very important in mentally justifying your use of violence. So we know that this dissonance, the separation that you see here, you're not killing human beings, you're not killing something with rational or logical thought, is used in many situations to facilitate mass violence. So of course, with our guides here in Berlin, this may evoke ideas of Nazism, of the concentration camp system. It is also widely used by terrorist groups today, such as ISIS, such as the Taliban, using language that we know of these groups today. Oh, that was my echoing, sorry. Of terming people of a different religion as infidels in their very special brand of jihad. So I thought this quote was actually quite useful to bring up to understand a little bit of the thinking, first of all, of why people join these organizations, and then what also allows them to carry out the activities that they do. And this idea of separating yourself from the crimes that you are committing is indeed really one of the most important elements to that process. So moving on to Berlin. So in the early years of the RAF's activity, they were known to really focus a lot of activity, particularly in 1970, early 1971, here in Berlin. So while this group is forming, while this group is even not even called the RAF yet, a lot of things are going on here in Berlin to solidify this group, to allow for acquisition of arms, of planning, of writing the original manifesto for the organization. A lot of that takes place here in Berlin. So talking about some of the known bases that might be useful, particularly as tour guides, but for anyone who might be interested in finding these locations here in Berlin. The first one is Kufsteiner Straße 12 in Schöneberg here in Berlin. So this was actually key member Ulrike Meinhof's residence. This is where she lived with her two children. And ultimately where Baader and Enslin, so other key two founding members of the organization, where they actually stayed with her for several weeks in 1970. So it was in this apartment where Meinhof, Baader, Enslin, and the lawyer Horst Mahler, where they laid plans for this clandestine paramilitary group, the RAF, and where they initially planned the acquisition of weapons, initially to build the organization. The second address is 89 Knestebeckstraße. That's in the district of Charlottenburg in West Berlin. And this is actually where Mahler, so again, the lawyer terrorist, quite catchy phrase that several of academics use. This is actually where on the day of the Triple Bank robbery, which we're going to talk about in a minute, where at 1:38 p.m., the West Berlin police were actually given an anonymous tip-off that the key members of the RAF were actually going to meet at this address. And of course, the police saw a golden opportunity to be able to arrest a lot of the key members of the organization. So on a first floor apartment under the name Hübner, the police actually then raided this flat under the name Hübner, and they found a Molotov cocktail and other flammable chemicals, as well as several car license plate numbers. So at around 6 p.m., while the police were still processing the flat where they're still raiding the apartment, the doorbell actually rang, and who walks in was Horst Mahler. So Horst Mahler was arrested forthwith, and it was actually this arrest that effectively ended his active RAF career as an active member of the organization. The last address that you see here, 19 Hauptstraße, Schöneberg, was another flat that was used as a hideout by the RAF, and that was under an apartment under the name Vent, and it was on the second floor, interestingly enough. What we're going to talk about next is we're going to talk about RAF actions that particularly occurred here in Berlin that might be useful to be more aware of if you're not already. So the first action was the liberation of Andreas Baader that we talked about earlier, that we mentioned briefly a little bit earlier, and his liberation took place on the 14th of May. And this occurred at the Institute for Social Issues, so the Deutsche Zentralinstituts für Sozialfragen in the district of Dahlem. So Dahlem is most associated today with the location of the Freie Universität Berlin, or the Free University of Berlin. So Andreas Baader was arrested while he was actually digging up a secret cache of arms a few months before. And after Baader's arrest, Ulrike Meinhof, who was already associated with the group, even though she wasn't directly participating in the very early actions of this group, Ulrike Meinhof used her contacts as a journalist to arrange for a book to be written about so-called young outsiders in society. And using this, Meinhof actually asked if Andreas Baader, who is imprisoned at this time, if he could be brought to the Institute for Social Issues so they could both look at research literature on the subject. At 11 o'clock, RAF members that included students Ingrid Schubert and Irene Goens, they were waiting in the foyer of the Institute, so they were not allowed into the reading room where Meinhof and Baader were at the time, so they were in kind of the entranceway. They opened the door for Enslin and then another unidentified male, who all four of them then stormed the reading room of the Institute. They assaulted the Institute clerk. He was not killed, he was injured. And then they did severely injured. They shot one of the armed guards in the reading room, and then Baader, Meinhof, and their accomplices all exited out of the bay window of the Institute for Social Issues in Dahlem, and then ran to a Mercedes and an Alfa Romeo vehicle. The latter vehicle was actually driven by Astrid Pohl, one of the people that we saw quotes from earlier. And these vehicles were waiting in an adjacent street, and they did all successfully escape. So this is widely considered to be the birth point of the RAF, and this was the moment that marked the criminal descent of Meinhof from a bourgeoisie, rather posh life of a journalist, a really well-known journalist at this time, into someone who was a wanted criminal. So you can actually see her her wanted poster just here, and this was a really pivotal moment in Ulrike Meinhof's life as well. So the next event that we have is the so-called Triple Bank Robbery, which occurred on the 29th of September, 1970. So in 10 minutes from 1948 a.m. to 1958 a.m., various little small groups of RAF members, so you had Enslin in one group, you had Horst Mahler and Ulrike Meinhof in another group. They robbed 3 different banks across West Berlin. So you have all the addresses here, but you have Deposenkasse 4, you have one Berliner Sparkasse and then the second Berliner Sparkasse. And in 10 minutes, what the idea was, is if you rush in across 3 different banks in West Berlin, the police are not going to know where to go. There's going to be calls coming in, and the police force is going to be overwhelmed. So this was actually conceptualized by Horst Mahler to overwhelm the police force, to mean that they could get away, and they could get away with the money. So successfully, even though Horst Mahler is arrested later that day, the RAF does get away with over 217,000 German marks. So it was indeed a very successful base point for creating a monetary basis for the RAF to expand. So going from activities in Berlin to the wider significance of the RAF in this period, I wanted to briefly touch on some of the RAF's known collaborators in this era. So one of them was the movement of the 2nd of June, so the Bewegung der 2. Junis. And this organization directly participated in the Triple Bank robbery on the 29th of September 1970. So this is one of the earliest collaborations between these groups. And then ultimately, the 2nd of June movement does actually merge with the RAF later on, and they become one solid entity. So they're not separated at that point. Going from national German movements, the RAF is well known, even in its early days, for having significant ties with Ali Hassan Salameh. So he is a member of El Fatah, of the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, And then later on, he is one of the key architects of Black September. So just to understand kind of what all these names are, the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, is, think of it as an overall blanket organization. El-Fatah is the largest faction of that multi-party organization. And then Black September is a splinter group or a special operative branch of El-Fatah. So Black September, Ali Hassan Salameh, being its organizer, was responsible for one of the most significant events in national German history in the modern era, which was the kidnap and murder of 11 Israeli athletes at the 1972 Munich Olympic Games. Of course, later on, we know that the RF's connection with the PLO Al-Fatah maintains. And of course, it is certain members of the PLO that do carry out the Lufthansa 181 flight hijacking. So from the 13th to the 17th of October in 1977. So the Lufthansa hijacking occurred at the height of the so-called third generation of the RAF's active Deutsche Eps of the German Autumn. And it lined up at the same time with the kidnapping of Hans-Martin Schleyer in 1977. One of the key demands for the safe return of Hans-Martin Schleyer and the 91 passengers on board this Lufthansa flight was the release and transport of 11 members of the RAF, including Gudrun Ensslin and Andreas Baader. At that point, by this time in 1977, Ulrike Meinhof has indeed already committed suicide during her imprisonment at Stammheim prison. So what we can see here is we can actually see that this group, it's not just a national group at this time. They have international connections, and even from well-known international connections with Al-Hassan Salameh and the PLO in the Middle East. Even though there is not direct connectivity with other groups, we know for a fact that the RAF, in the language that they use, clearly had some conversation, had some knowledge and cognitive thinking with other terrorist organizations at this time. So even if we just take the phrase armed struggle of bewaffnete Kampf in German, this is a phrase that was widely used for the manifestos, also of the Provisional IRA in Northern Ireland. So what you can see is these ideas are not just kept in a box, that the RAF does have significant connectivity with international terrorists of paramilitary groups, if you want to call it that, at this time. So the last known collaboration that I want to discuss for the RAF is actually with the Stasi, with the Staatssicherheitsdienst of East Germany, of the DDR. This gets its own slide. So we know that as early as June 8th, 1970, the Stasi were well aware of the early RAF, even though, again, this group had not defined itself as the RAF at this time. It has not released its manifesto yet. We know that the Stasi were very conscious that members of the RAF were using Berlin-Schönefeld, the airport that is now being merged with the Berlin-Brandenburg National Airport. That Berlin-Schönefeld in what is that time East Berlin was used as a means of transit for early members of the RAF to the Al-Fatah training camp on the Jordanian-Syrian border that was at this time training Palestinians in guerrilla warfare and was run by Al-Hassan Salameh. So the future organizer of Black September. It's important to note that in West Berlin, Ulrike Meinhof, her face was plastered all across the city in those wanted posters, that one of which I showed you a bit earlier. And without the acquiescence of the Stasi, without their knowledge, without literally allowing them to go through, Baader, Ensslin, and Meinhof, and the other core members who were going to the Middle East, they would not have been allowed to cross into East Berlin from Friedrichstrasse station and carry on through East Berlin to Schönefeld Airport. So very much so this organization is consciously aware. And why the Stasi, why the Staatssicherheitsdienst kind of allows this organization to pass through is very much, they see it early on as a possible opportunity to allow for chaos to kind of overthrow from within West Germany. So very much so, it's seen as an opportunity. So we know that as early as 1970, there was an implicit, later explicit agreement between the Stasi and the RAF that East Berlin would offer a possibility for the RAF for transit, escape, refuge. And this is made expressly with the understanding that East Berlin would not be touched. So East Berlin, the DDR, would be left alone, and they would not have any activities by the RAF affecting their government. So we also know that in the early 1980s, 2 to 3 times a year, active terrorists, active members of the RAF were allowed to pass through. So during this time, again, the early 1980s, they were extensively questioned by the Stasi, but at the same time, they were also schooled and even weapons trained while they were being shielded from the West German manhunt against them. However, by 1983, this relationship sort of fizzles out. So the RAF realizes, okay, the East Germany is not going to take any further, more active support of the RAF. They're not going to facilitate them really any greater. However, between 1980 and 1983, so kind of by the tail end of this close relationship, we know now that 10 former RAF members went into hiding in the DDR. So the Stasi secured them new identities, apartments, employment, and they took care of those who left the RAF in an intermittent basis throughout that period. At the same time, they're closely monitored. The East German secret police, again, want to make sure that they're not stirring up trouble in the DDR itself. So we know that up to 20 unofficial Stasi personnel were assigned to the former terrorists, so monitoring what they're doing through this period. We also know that some of the ex-RAF members also became unofficial informers for the Stasi. So they actually started to work for the secret police itself. So it does denote really how close these ties were for a period. So the former terrorists of the former members of the RAF, they carry out inconspicuous, normal lives in the DDR. And in 1986, 3 former RAF members who ended up becoming like known. So in this kind of witness protection sort of era, someone finds out their identities, and the Stasi immediately, really showing how close a contact that they still had with them, the Stasi immediately got them out of that situation, provided them with new identities, and got them immediately to new apartments as quickly as possible. So what you see here is in my handy dandy archival research, you actually have one excerpt of a document which actually shows in the 1970 the arrest of an RAF member, Hans-Jürgen Backers, which has been made publicly available by the Stasi Media Center, and which actually shows that Backer was detained by the Stasi. He was questioned. So the Stasi had literally pages long of documentation knowing that this group is forming. Backer actually has a weapon, a pistol on his person. And after Backers is questioned in 1970, the Stasi, after clearing it with their superiors, gives him his pistol back and says, yep, you can keep going on into West Berlin. Don't stay here, but we're going to give you your gun back and you can proceed right on. So you can see the Stasi absolutely knew that this organization existed, and for an intimate period of time between 1980 and 1983, they actively facilitated the RAF's activities, training, and then also hiding RAF members who needed to leave West Germany. Oh, and that brings us up to time, I think, which is pretty good. I was kind of worried about the timing of this a little bit. So what I hope this presentation has given you is a little bit of background into why this organization forms, how this organization is connected with the escalation from the student protest movements in the 1960s to the escalation of political violence vocalized, shown by the terrorist group, the RAF, a fringe movement of these student protests. Some of their key known locations here in Berlin, as far as hideouts, as far as operational bases, 2 of the most significant events that occur in their early years that focus here in Berlin, their known collaborators, their connections with the wider terrorist movements that are occurring in this era, and then also their fascinating connection with the East German secret police, the Stasi. Thank you. Was it silent? That's a silent clap because everyone's unmuted. But oh, that's nice.
Elizabeth, that was so interesting. I really enjoyed that so much. And I wanted to say two things. First of all, thank you, Constanza and Alasni, for making this possible, for organizing it today. I forgot to mention that at the beginning. And I have a perhaps silly question for Lizzie. I remember when the film came out, which I, of course, forget the exact name of the film. Do you know which one I'm talking about?
It is literally now on the cover of, so it's the Baader
Yes, yeah, exactly, the Baader Meinhof complex. I remember seeing it in the theaters when it came out in Berlin and being so excited because I wanted to learn more because I didn't know anything about that era. And I found the film good, but a little bit hard to follow because there's so many different actors. And I'm now excited to watch it again with this knowledge and so many years later. But I wanted to know if you felt like the film was an accurate representation, I mean, as much as could be in a very Hollywood-esque film.
I think very much so. I mean, I would love to kind of speak to the actors, especially Moritz Bleibtreu, who played Andreas Baader. Because what I feel very much the film tries to do is they try to encapsulate the reasons behind membership for the core members, and that's something that I can't do because they commit suicide after the Lufthansa flight fails in 1977. So Enslin and Baader commit suicide. Ulrike Meinhof has already done so, unfortunately, and it's very much kind of a psychological portrayal of these three main characters. You notice that Horst Mahler, even though he appears a couple of times, and he was literally the fourth most important member of this organization, he does not really appear in that film. And very much so, what the film is trying to capture is the life that especially Enslin and Meinhof leave behind. And they try to kind of give motivations for why they would leave that life behind. So in terms of Enslin, oppressive, very conservative parents who don't actually seem to be that oppressive when they give interviews later on. And then Meinhof from a cheating husband, bourgeoisie lifestyle that she was kind of supposed to just ignore and keep on living. Kind of very much tries to give a motivation of why those three members form the organization, and then why they are considered to be so charismatic. They're so different from the status quo. They're so different from everyone that seems to be in society at that point. And that really became a psychological allure because those three members are roughly 5 to 8 years older than the other members. So again, I haven't looked up their exact ages just yet, but again, significantly older than the members that they end up recruiting, right? So they represent these radical idealists. They represent something so completely different that these other younger members want to imitate, right? So that is why we get the second generation of the RAF. That's why we get the third generation of the RAF. And that is why even from prison, these three core members are still seen as the leaders of the organization. And very much the film tries to encapsulate why even from prison, even when they're removed from any of the actions, that these people are almost brought to cult-like figures within this organization. So that's what I think the film encapsulates really well. But again, some of it is speculation because we don't have interviews from them because they've committed suicide.
Thank you.
No worries. Do you have other? It's fine if you don't have other questions. That makes my job so much easier.
I've got a question if that's okay. First of all, great presentation.
Right.
Absolutely loved it. Hi. I was wondering if you have any thoughts on how the West German state might have reacted differently. So towards the end of the 60s, when groups like these begin to splinter off and emerge, how do you think the West German state might have reacted to prevent further escalation?
Well, I think, I mean, certainly with a lot of my colleagues, this is actually a key point of research. So the connection of these student protests to state suppression There we go. Couldn't think of the word for a minute. So this is a huge aspect of research in terms of the provisional IRA. Of course, the same era, this group is forming kind of under similar bases of protest movements to armed struggle. And very much so, I think it's a consensus among people who have researched this a lot longer than I have at this point, that very much it's a self-fulfilling spiral, right? That as soon as the police have maybe one action, like in the case of the murder of Benito Onazorg, one action of violence, that then this spirals into reprisal violence by the protesters, by the escalation of, you know, throwing stones, of attacking the police on the street, of provoking this activity. And then that provocation then leads to actual severe injury, if not death, like we see, for example, in 1968 in Northern Ireland, with then the sending in of actual troops from Britain. But we also see this, for example, with the Battle of Tagalog, with protesters being injured with the use of tear gas and water cannons. And very much this creates a spiral that I think the government, how much a government can actually do in that situation, I think is really a question. I mean, I'm thankful that it's not my decision, to be perfectly honest. But I think it's a self-fulfilling prophecy, really. I think if police are not seen as taking a hard stance of violence against them, then, for example, ordinary citizens, other citizens, become distrustful of the police being able to protect them. So a hard stance is seen as what's needed against certain acts of maybe violence against the police. But then this violence then only reaffirms the belief of extreme thinkers. So a small number of extreme, but indeed charismatic thinkers in these organizations that say, well, what this shows is that the government is not going to listen to us, that we possibly could be injured or killed by speaking out. And then this brings people to the answer that armed struggle, that taking up weaponry against the state is the only option. But I don't think there's actually a way, or a way that we've seen yet, for governments to kind of extract themselves from that situation. I just haven't seen it. So it's a hard thing. I don't think I have a good answer to that, right?
No, it's fine. So, but in this particular situation, is the argument that the mistakes were made as the West German state was formed in the late 40s, and because of denazification, once that mistake was made, then something like this was probably inevitable. Is that the argument?
I also think as well that West Germany is taking a stance that they are seeing with other countries at this time. So if we take a look at the hardline stance against paramilitary activity in Northern Ireland, I think it would also be a mistake to think that West Germany is operating in a vacuum in that way. I think very much a hardline stance. We even see this, for example, to some degree, if not a high degree, in the civil rights protests in the United States, that a hardline stance against anything other than quiet, peaceful protests is going to be enacted with violence. Now we know West Germany takes that one step further, and they actually demonize these protests as something that is anti-German, that is subversive against the state, and something that is even considered as being terroristic activity. So I think maybe one thing in that light that West Germany could have done is controlled the media and said, do not call these people terrorists, because they're not terrorists. They are also the same as the government is taking from these ideas from similar movements that are going on at this time, that very much the student protesters are doing the same. So to say, well, that very much West Germany treats it maybe too much as a vacuum, and kind of doesn't allow for enough flexibility, and also maybe doesn't control the media as much as they really should. Certainly with the demonization of Rudi Dutschke, of calling him, a terrorist communist in this weird kind of hybrid way, really would probably been the best way. And then maybe give him a protection detail, to be quite frank. Probably the best way. Yeah, other.
I had another question. If
Go ahead.
no one else went. I was curious. You talked so much about the group itself, and I was wondering, in terms of public perception of the RAF. I can imagine it was very much, the perception was different across generational lines. You spoke about the older generation and the younger generation fighting against that. And so I can imagine there was some sympathy, broad sympathy for the RAF amongst the younger folks, but not so much amongst the older generations. Is that accurate? Can you talk a little bit about public perception?
That's quite accurate. I think very much so. I mean, speaking, I think from how my own family would have seen this organization, I think very much the RAF were firstly in the early days kind of seen as wayward children, like, the German tusk kind of going on, oh, this is not good, this is not okay. But yeah, very much, I think the older generation, kind of seeing how much my grandparents are tied to the television, very much probably would have fed off the media perception of them as well. More for the younger generation who is questioning, obviously heavily questioning the media. But I think when we talk about people who, for example, are just in the student protest movement and are maintaining protests, albeit in a more or less peaceful sense, the RAF, when it breaks off from the student protest movement, is still seen as a fringe group. It is still seen as a minority. And keep in mind, through the RAF's first generation, you're only talking about 50 members, like maybe 53, if the calculations don't include Ensslin, Baader, and Meinhof. It might be 53. So you're talking really about a very small group of people. And the student protest movement, by the time the death of Benito Onizorg happens, you're talking about a national movement. You're talking about tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of students. So 50 versus hundreds of thousands, it's a fringe. And I think, yeah, when you start having collaboration and known collaboration with the hijacking of the Lufthansa flight, with the German Autumn, it is really then seen as something that is to be made afraid of. And this group wanted to be feared as well. So then you're going to start seeing less sympathy even with younger people by the time you get to the German Autumn of 1977.
Thank you.
Yeah. Is there other questions, or is it wine o'clock?
Sorry, I'm being perhaps annoying.
You're Heather.
My questions.
I'm
just curious, seeing as how this is very obviously a big focus of interest to you. Are you at all able to weave this history into any tours that you give in Berlin? I find that I so rare. I don't even know if I've mentioned this history once to tours that I've had, even though it's a really fascinating topic. And there's so much, of course, else to talk about in Berlin. But are you ever able to bring it up with your guests? I guess maybe at Checkpoint Charlie with Rudi Dutschke Strasse could be an option. But yeah, that was my other question.
I think at this time it is a specialized topic. I think it is something, if we're talking about this presentation being a tour guide's presentation, I mean, I think maybe it's something like, let's say you are doing a Cold War tour, to definitely talk about. And I think it is really useful to maybe include these ideas in terms of popular ideas of communism of socialism, I should say, Marxist socialism in particular. At this point, how this becomes a very complicated narrative. I mean, let's say, for example, you are giving an in-depth Cold War tour to talk about the collaboration of the Stasi and the RAF. That's also why I thought it was such a good point to end on as well. I think would be very interesting and very useful. I think especially if you also have guests that have a military background, especially an American military background. I mean, I know from my father having his active service in Germany in the 1980s, he would have been aware of this group. In particular, actions against the US military had definitely declined by the 1980s, but it was certainly something he would have been aware of. So I think for military personnel, it's definitely something that I'm sure, for example, British military personnel would have also been advised, okay, don't go near protest marches, don't maybe do this and that. And part of it would have been because that this group was active in this era. So I think it may be more of a targeted audiences sort of inclusion, but definitely with its Cold War connection with the Stasi, with the secret police, I think it does have a lot of resonance to stir the pot, to complicate this history.
Can I add something?
Yeah.
I talk about it sometimes not in great depth, but first of all, if I pick up people from hotels in West Berlin, or I'm in the West Berlin area in front of the CO building where Hubert Humphrey or Humphrey Hubert, I always get his name mixed, the vice president, where the famous pudding scandal took place. And the whole area was, I mean, the CNO was very popular for student protest because it was close to the Academie de Kunst and the TU University. So I don't talk about how it got into terrorism. And I found that very interesting that you made the connection from being ignored in the 60s to what happens later. Another place where sometimes I mention it, but again, I don't feel that my knowledge is so strong that I feel so comfortable to talk about it so much, is on the tours that we used to do for SPB, when we drive by the opera house where the protest took place, and mention it in 2 or 3 sentences. So yeah.
And I think that's such a good point, Shalomit, because inherently with this group being a West German terrorist group, it can make it difficult. Like, let's say, for example, if we're by, you know, the main sites, you know, the Brandenburg Gate, etc., we don't quite get to the area where this group was active, or where the events that led to the group's formation were active. So I think that's quite a good point. We should build more tours of West Berlin as an association in general. Yeah, we could try. Come on, guys.
I've got a great West Berlin tour when we're not in lockdown anymore.
Yes. Oh, girl.
It's actually Ronen's tour, to be honest, but he taught me it, so yeah.
Ryan was raising a hand.
Yeah, if I can quickly add something. I know it's quite difficult to bring this into a lot of the main sites tours that most of us offer, but on Wilhelmstrasse, there's a place, the Tommy Weisbecker House, which is just a couple of blocks down from the topography of terror. And Weisbecker was a kind of a fringe element of the Baader Meinhof group who was killed by the police at the start of the 70s, I think. And the house is named after him. It's been under constant occupation for decades. I mean, they have the right to reside there, but it's a good jumping off point to talk about that, but also, you know, the history of occupation and squatting in Kreuzberg. So there is somewhere that is very central, that's not really out of our way. So
yeah, so definitely for people who do kind of like the alternative modern Berlin kind of 1990s, and maybe talking about where all the artist communes and things come up. Certainly the Kommune 1, the Commune 1, was definitely one of the earliest kind of points of this communal living, of this socialist kind of living. And I think that is maybe some guides would be like, oh, it's too political, but I know a lot of guides who do this kind of alternative tour who like to make it kind of a political inclusion. So that, yeah, it's another fab point.
It's hard to make a proper tour around this because the locations are so spread out.
Exactly. Yeah, it's such a...
Unless, as you said, you are including it as part of the Cold War tour. You know, and then
you have to kind of be I think maybe be creative.
Yeah.
Kind of, yeah, where that comes in. But maybe, as Brian says, that's an intuitive inclusion as well, kind of talking more about the 1960s kind of can we call it a manifestation of socialist ideas. how to word that well. Is there other questions? Anyone who is not my, because I've got you 3 on the icons right now, so anyone who is unseen in this presentation.
I'm gonna have to shoot off, but thank you very much.
No, thank you, Shalomit, for coming, or virtually
and
coming.
for showing your dog Kira.
Kira says thank you too, even though she
Look
just,
at her.
it's not a sign of boredom. It's, you know, she's just taking all the information in.
It's intense relaxation.
What?
It's intense relaxation.
It's intense relaxation, yeah.
Well, if no one else has any questions, then I'll go ahead and say again, thank you, Lizzie, for presenting this subject to us today, which again, I find so interesting, but yet know so little about. So you've inspired me to watch that movie again and perhaps do some reading with the knowledge that I have. And yeah, it was just fantastic. So thank you so much for your work.
I'm quite glad.
And for those of you who are watching this video on YouTube, we hope to have additional lectures in the future organized by Connie and Elazny, and we'll post again when we have them.
Lovely.
So thank you so much, everyone, for coming out. Lizzie, for your hard work and expertise, and enjoy the rest of the day. All right.
Thank you for everyone in the comments who's thanked me as well.
All right. So bye, everyone. Thank you so much. Bye.